Welcome to our webcast, How Finance Leaders Partner with CIOs to Drive Maximum Business Value from the Cloud. Brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and sponsored by Flexera. I'm Joe Fleischer, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I do want to cover a few features of the console you're viewing. On the left side of your console, you will be able to view slides and respond to polling questions. In a moment, I'll go over how to respond to polls. In the meantime, I would point out that in the resource list area of your console, you will be able to click on a link to download a PDF document that comprises slides from our webcast, as well as click on links to view information about upcoming events that offer the opportunity to hear from and meet finance leaders in person. I'll tell you about one such event, CFO Live in New York City, toward the end of our webcast. Although we will plan to dedicate the latter portion of our webcast to addressing your questions, we do invite you to type in your questions and comments at any time during our webcast in the Q&A area of your console. Those who join our live webcast have the opportunity to earn a certificate that represents one continuing professional education or CPE credit. So that you can be eligible, we ask that you respond to all three polling questions that will intersperse during the course of our live webcast. To respond to a polling question when it appears, we ask that you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then click on the Submit button so that we are able to record your response. After we have posed our third and our last polling question during our webcast, if you have answered all three polling questions during the course of our live webcast and are therefore eligible to receive credit, you will be able to click on an icon to download the certificate, and that will be located in the certification section of your console. If you've answered all three polling questions during the course of our live webcast but are not able to retrieve your certificate, you will be able to do so when this webcast is available on demand later this week in the past webinars section of CFO.com. Now, before we get started, I do want to tell you about our very distinguished guests. Joining us today are Joe Frieda, who's CFO with Flexera, and Kim Wines, who is Vice President of Cloud Strategy and Spend Optimization with Flexera. Some quick background. Joe Frieda, as I mentioned, is the Chief Financial Officer with Flexera. In that role, he leads the global financial strategy and operations of Flexera. He's also responsible for capital and operating budgets, taxes, and investor relations. He also provides oversight of procurement, IT, and facilities. Previously held senior financial management roles at software companies such as InstallShield, of which Flexera is the developer, and Platinum Technology, and he began his career with Pricewaterhouse, now known as PwC, where he managed client engagements in a variety of industries, a variety of companies, and a variety of industries, both publicly traded and privately traded companies. Joining Joe is Kim Wines. I mentioned she's Vice President of Cloud Strategy and Spend Optimization with Flexera. Kim, is a thought leader on the topic of cloud cost optimization and a frequent speaker and blogger on topics that include public cloud pricing and discounting, as well as best practices for cloud management. As an executive with RightScale, which Flexera acquired in 2018, she spearheaded the definitive annual State of the Cloud report on cloud adoption, to which she will refer throughout our webcast. And indeed, at this stage, it is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Kim Wines of Flexera. Please give a warm welcome to her. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for that introduction, and glad to have you all here so we can talk a little bit about cloud and how we think about managing cloud as a CFO and how we partner with the CIO to do that. Because we do know that cloud has become more important. We're going to share a few stats on that in just a moment. And then we'll talk about some of the key cloud challenges that are going to impact the CFO. What's different about cloud that you need to be aware of? And then I'll turn things over to Joe Frieda. He's the CFO from Flexera to talk about 4 areas for you to think about partnering, as well as some takeaways that you can take home with you or take back to the office with you and start making happen within your organization. So let's start with a few stats. So it's important to note where our IT spend is going today. And this pie chart here represents Gartner's view of the rough breakdown. So about 20% of IT spend today, obviously varies depending on the organization, but on average is going to cloud. And that includes SaaS software, but it also includes expenses on public clouds such as IaaS and PaaS services from Amazon and others. Now, in addition to that, we have what we often refer to as shadow IT spend. So this is IT spend that individuals are maybe making under the radar, or business units are making, or teams are making, that may not be part of that more formalized IT spend. And that can be significant as well, often representing as much as 40% of the formal IT spend, depending on the organization. So the point here is we do have a lot of our budget within IT that's going to cloud, so it's something we need to be paying attention to. And in fact, this is another chart from Gartner that's showing, in terms of data center capacity and footprint, we actually reached peak enterprise data center capacity in 2016. So what that means is, over time, we're shifting more and more of the applications and the software and the business services that we run to run in cloud environments. So this is a continue to be important for our organizations. So let's just set the stage with our taxonomy. So sometimes when people think about cloud, they think of Office 365, or in the case of my mother, it's, iCloud on your Apple device. But really, there's three different layers here. So the one that we might be most familiar with is software as a service. So these are applications that we're going to be procuring that are based in the cloud. So our Salesforce.com, or our SAP Concur, or Office 365, or any of those other applications that we run out of the cloud. But then we also need to consider our infrastructure as a service and platform as a service layers, and these are delivered typically by large public cloud providers such as AWS, Azure, Google, Oracle, Alibaba, etc. So we're going to be touching on both of these as we go through this conversation. And if we look at the spend in those areas, you can see in this chart with the different shades of blue that overall cloud spend is rising. So SaaS spend is rising at 17% per year, and overall cloud spend, including IaaS plus PaaS plus SaaS, is growing at 21% per year. And that's because IaaS and PaaS are growing even faster than SaaS at this point, while SaaS is still the biggest portion of cloud spend today. So if you think about that, overall IT spend is growing at about a 3% per year rate, so cloud spend is growing 7 times as fast, and that means that what's happening over time is a larger percentage of our budget in IT is shifting to the cloud. So if it's 20% today, this is going to indicate that over time that's going to be bigger and bigger. So that's why we want to really get a handle on cloud spend while that spend might be still relatively manageable, so that we're optimized and we know how to manage that spend going forward, so that as it gets bigger, we have these costs under control. So let's go ahead and turn it back to Joe here for a minute for a polling question.
Well, thank you very much, Kim, for setting the stage. And indeed, as Kim mentioned, we do want to pose the first, actually, of 3 polling questions. Our first polling question asks attendees to indicate the extent to which you agree with the following statement. Finance executives are working closely with counterparts in IT to develop and put in place your company's digital transformation strategy. And what you're welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then click on the submit button so that we are able to record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. And again, after you choose the radio button that corresponds to your answer, we do ask that you click on the submit button so that we are able to record the extent to which you agree or perhaps disagree with the statement that finance executives are working closely with counterparts in IT to develop and put in place your company's digital transformation strategy. And what we can see from among respondents, I think this is quite interesting, is that the good news, clearly a majority agree. Indeed, I'd say about three-fourths of respondents agree. I would acknowledge that about 12% at the very least disagree, and a very close third, if you will, don't know. So in other words, I think what we're finding, 3/4 of respondents at the very least agree, but I think there's always the opportunity to move the needle. I would also acknowledge that the percentage of the 13% who don't know, I think that's significant and worth keeping in mind as well. With that in mind, we will now continue our discussion with Kim.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, so let's acknowledge that cloud we talked about the shift to cloud. The reason we're moving to cloud, there's certainly a cost aspect to it, but really what we're trying to do is overall drive business value in our organization. And the important thing to note here, we just did a poll about digital transformation. This is more data from Gartner, but digital initiatives are ubiquitous. So this year in their CEO survey, they found that 82% of organizations did have a digital initiative of some sort, and that's up from 62% last year. So most of your organizations are doing some type of digital transformation. It looks maybe a little bit different from organization to organization. And in addition, cloud is an important piece of it. Certainly not the only piece. It may be about new products and services you're delivering to customers, but for many companies, those products and services are going to be delivered in the cloud, essentially. And so it's moving from an approach where it was sort of the next generation, if we looked at it, 5 years back or 10 years back, and now it's really almost becoming a baseline or a foundation for most things that we're doing in our digital transformation initiative. So let's now turn to what are the challenges of cloud, like what's going to be different in this world where we're using more and more cloud. It's becoming a bigger part of our IT budget. And so we're going to focus in on 3 challenges that really relate to the world of the CFO as well as the world of the CIO. So user-driven consumption, complex billing, and the need for continuous optimization. So let's start with challenge number 1. So challenge number 1 is we're buying cloud services differently than what we've traditionally bought on-prem hardware or software. And this is really user-driven consumption. So let's talk about what that looks like. So if we look at our traditional IT resources, typically what happened is we'd have a project maybe to build a data center, add capacity to a data center, and we'd have evaluation of what was needed by our technical folks, and we'd go out and talk to vendors, and we'd put together prices and negotiate discounts and go through a fairly lengthy approval process for that to say, hey, did we make a business case for it? Do we agree with how much we're going to spend? Yes, then let's go ahead and go forward. So all of that was done in advance, and then that capacity was added to our data center, or that software was bought, or that application was procured, whatever that might be. So if you look in the world of cloud, it looks a little bit more like the Wild Wild West, or Best Buy on Black Friday for those of us that are in the U.S., where we have people all across the organization that might be buying cloud solutions, whether that's SaaS solutions or buying essentially more capacity from our public cloud provider, with none of that pre-approval process. And by the way, nor would we want to do that. We wouldn't want to go back to that world, because part of the benefit of cloud is that ability to be more agile and work more quickly. So, if you make this look like a little bit of a timeline, right, here we have over, let's say, a period of 5 years, our hardware and software refresh rate might be every 3 years or every 5 years, depending on the particular vendor, what we purchased. When we move to SaaS and we look at our big, well-known SaaS applications, our Salesforce or our Concurs or our Workdays or our Office 365, that might be either on an annual or in some cases on an every 3-year purchase cycle. So it's not too different. But now if we start to look at all the other shadow SaaS that might be being bought beyond those top few applications, that may be bought at any point in time, and that may be bought by different groups within your organization, maybe without even going through IT. And then if we look at public cloud, IaaS, PaaS purchases, essentially every time we add capacity or deploy something into the cloud, like a developer or an IT person scaling up a production system, we're essentially buying more cloud. Essentially, the price and the cost is going to go up, and we're going to see that in our monthly bill. So we need to move from a model of that sort of pre-approval process model. We need to develop new models that are going to work in this more continuous environment. The other thing to note is that shadow IT that we talked about. How extensive is that? So often when I talk to organizations about their use, for example, of SaaS, they're like, hey, yeah, we have 20 SaaS apps, or these are the big 4 that we need to focus on. This is data from an actual Symantec survey where they surveyed CIOs and they said, how many SaaS apps do you have? And the answer on average was 40. And then they actually did scans to determine how many SaaS apps they were really using, and there was an additional 888. So essentially, a lot of times IT only has visibility into that small slice. Now, that small slice probably does represent a much bigger portion of your spend. However, we have to keep in mind that anything that's shadow also not only has spend implications, but also risk implications. And so we need to figure out how are we going to get a handle on that shadow SaaS as well. All right, let's turn it back to Joe. We'll do a second polling question here.
Thank you very much, Kim. I think that statistic that you shared about shadow IT is quite compelling, and I think that also raises the question about visibility, especially to members of our audience who may be concerned that they don't have visibility not only into the tools themselves, but also into the spend associated with them. So what we're going to do now is pose, as Kim said, our second of 3 polling questions, and we want to find out the extent to which attendees agree or disagree with the statement that your finance team has full visibility into your company's cloud spend. As with our first poll, what you're welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer. Then click on the submit button so that we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. And again, as with our first poll, after you select the radio button, we do ask that you click on the submit button so that in this case, we can record the extent to which you agree or disagree with a statement that your finance team has full visibility into your company's cloud spend. What we'll do is reveal how attendees have responded, and I don't think this is a huge shock. So first of all, what we are seeing is that a plurality, so it's not a majority, a plurality, about nearly 48% of respondents have indicated that at the very least you agree. That said, a significant percentage, so about a little more than 38% of respondents have indicated that at the very least you disagree, and then about 14% don't know. I think what's telling here is that, one, we're talking about a plurality. It's a near majority, but a plurality nonetheless. A significant percentage who disagree, who don't have visibility or don't perceive they have visibility into cloud spend among their finance team, and then also those who just don't know. I think that's very compelling, and with that in mind, we're now going to continue our discussion with Kim.
All right, thanks, Joe. All right, so let's move on to challenge number 2. So we talked about the fact that cloud is bought differently. It's really often user-driven consumption. And then the second challenge is that visibility into cloud spend is hard, and billing is complex, and this is especially true within the public cloud. So most organizations today, according to our State of the Cloud report for many years, are using multiple public clouds, typically at least 2 public clouds. And so you have not just Cloud A to deal with, but also Cloud B to deal with, and each of those cloud providers is sending you a monthly bill. And there's an invoice. It's a summary of how much you have to pay them, but when you try to get into the detail of what's behind how much you owe, they provide you with a detailed cloud billing file, but that cloud billing file for most organizations has hundreds of thousands or millions of line items in it. And that's because they're providing you with detail on every single resource that you've bought of different types in different cloud services, down to kind of a minute-by-minute basis. And so that is really just very difficult for finance teams or accounting teams to deal with. You can't even open that type of a file in a spreadsheet. And so you need to really put in place tools that are going to help you ingest that billing data, often from multiple cloud providers, summarize it, allocate it out based on some rules that you set up, and allow the various teams and users of that technology to see what their costs are. In addition, we've seen some companies, for example, that have built sort of their own little tools or BI tools, or used a BI tool to try to analyze it. However, the cloud providers are constantly changing the formats of these cloud bills and adding new types of line items in it and changing the definitions of what's in the different fields of the cloud bill. So it becomes really, really difficult for people to keep up with on those sort of homegrown solutions. And then lastly, an important aspect of the cloud bill is tagging, and tagging is needed to allocate costs. So really that's the way that you can say, hey, this particular resource, so this particular, for example, virtual machine or cloud instance it's sometimes called, is something that's being used by this team or this application or for production purposes or for this region or whatever the different ways that you want to slice and dice those cloud costs. So that's an important aspect that needs to be set up properly in the cloud, but also within whatever tool you're using to analyze and optimize your cloud costs needs to take that data and leverage that. So that's one important item. The other aspect that I want to just touch on about billing and the complexity of billing in public cloud is the fact that discounting is very different than what we're used to prior, right? When we used to buy things for on-premise or for our data center, or our traditional software contracts or enterprise agreements, we basically would do a negotiation through our procurement team and we get X% discount from that vendor on our bill. And with public cloud providers, they do have some negotiated discount programs. Often they're tiered based on how much you're spending with them. But typically the discount that you're going to get there is a fairly small or modest discount, you know, often in the single-digit percentage or maybe double digits, but probably less than 20% if you're a very large user. But as you move into, but you have other options for discounting that really can be much more significant. And the biggest one of those is something that both AWS and Azure have. They call it a reserved instance. Google has something similar. They call it a committed use discount, but the concept is the same. And the idea is that you pre-commit, and in some cases you prepay. So in the case of Azure, you prepay. In the case of AWS, you can choose how much you prepay. But you pre-commit to a certain amount of capacity, but you have to commit things like what region it's in for the cloud provider, what type of instance flavor you're using, so meaning the balance of CPU and memory on those machines, what type of operating system you're going to run on it, and you make that commitment for either a 1-year period or a 3-year period. And if you make it for a 1-year period, the discounts typically range from 15 to maybe 30-ish%. Again, these are all published list prices for everybody. It's not negotiated. And then if you commit for 3 years, you get a bigger discount, and that might be anywhere from 30 to 70%. And the discounts vary based on the region, the type of instance, et cetera. And all of those are published on the white website of those cloud providers, so you know exactly how much you're going to pay and exactly how much you're going to save. So that's great because we can choose to do that at any point in time. It's not just a once every 3 years. I can decide to commit for some of the capacity I'm using today, and then a month from now, I can decide to increase that, and 3 months from that, I can buy more reserved instances and make a bigger commitment. So at any point in time, you can do that, and they will apply those. Think of it just like a Groupon or a discount coupon. They will apply that to any running cloud instance that meets the parameters of the reserved instance that you purchased, right? So it doesn't have to be a specific machine. It's anything that matches those parameters. So that's great, and you get these great discounts. However, think of it like buying a gym membership, right? If you pay for the gym membership and you don't go to the gym, you're still paying for the gym membership. And if you pay for the gym membership and then you decide to join a yoga studio or a CrossFit studio instead, you're paying for the gym membership and your CrossFit studio as well. So that's something that can commonly happen where people buy reserved instances, but they don't anticipate how things might change in the future. So they've made a certain type of commitment for a certain type of instance in a certain region, and then something changes in their business and a new, better instance type comes out, and they're developers or their IT team goes and uses that, and suddenly we have a mismatch, and we're paying for the old reserved instance that we're not using, and we're also paying for the new instance that we are using. So this is an important concept for you guys to get your arms around as finance professionals, because this is something that you really need to work closely with your CIO on, because you need to balance both that discounting aspect as well as the waste aspect. And I have an interesting story of this. We have to think about things differently than in the data center world. So we had a customer, a large company that shall remain nameless, and they had some workloads and application that they knew they were going to move to the cloud. And so what the team that was doing it did, they weren't super familiar with the whole concept of reserved instances, and they were talking to their sales rep from the cloud provider. And so what they decided to do is kind of think of it like a data center. And so they, in advance of actually moving the application, they went and they bought reserved instances to cover the maximum capacity that they thought they might need over the next 3 years. So first of all, they didn't need to do that. They were paying for something before they started using it. They can wait till they move the application to the cloud, see how that's performing, what instance flavors they want to run, and then purchase reserved instance capacity, right? So they could have waited till a month after they were using it. They can also buy reserved instance capacity to only cover a portion of their use in the cloud, or their kind of minimum level that they're always going to be at. So that's a common and recommended strategy often. So then, of course, they realized, hey, that we didn't need to do this. They moved it to the cloud. They realized they'd bought the wrong stuff, and they were kind of stuck with this prepaid capacity that was wrong for them. Now, in this case, they were able to sort of reallocate that to a different business unit in the organization, but not everybody has that option. So something that you as the CFO or the finance leader needs to keep your eye on, and not get too sort of stars in your eyes with, we're going to get this great discount, and realize, yeah, but I just overbought something that I'm not using, or I bought the wrong thing. All right, so the last piece is challenge number 3, cloud spend must be managed differently. So because of this mode that we're in, where it's kind of user-driven consumption, we need to put into place the appropriate guardrails, but we also need to have continuous optimization. We need to not be thinking of this as something we do before we buy and we approve it and everything's good, but we need to think of something as, let's put in place our policies and our guardrails, but then we need to continuously monitor what's going on and continuously optimize what we have. So here's a piece of data from our State of the Cloud report about why the spend optimization is so important. And if you look at it, cloud users are wasting, and this is public cloud specifically, on average, a third of their spend, 35% of their spend. And by the way, this is not new. In the old world, or traditional world of on-premise and data centers, we often had waste as well. The difference was, if we, let's say, overbought capacity in a data center, it was a sunk cost. We couldn't really get out of it. We kind of had to buy in advance of using it, and we often bought to some type of a max or near max capacity. And so we had that waste, but there was no way to really recover that cost. In the case of cloud, it's very different, right? If we have waste in the cloud and we identify it and we eliminate it, the next minute we start saving money. The next time we receive our monthly cloud bill or get an update, tomorrow about our cloud bill month to date, we're saving money. So there's a big incentive to pay attention to the spend and to look at ways to realize those savings. And this becomes especially important as companies' cloud spend is growing. So often we'll see somebody that comes in and says, right now we're spending $3 million a year on public cloud, but a year from now or 2 years from now, we're going to be spending $10 million a year on public cloud. So if we're going to be growing that much, let's get this stuff under control before it gets out of hand. Now, even in SaaS, which has, maybe a little bit more of that traditional decision-making process and approval process before we buy, even in the SaaS world, things aren't right-sized. So this was based on a survey we did last year about this time, and you can see that really fewer than half of the respondents are saying that they feel like their SaaS licenses are right-sized. Sometimes they have too little, in which case they're out of compliance. That can be problematic, especially when renewal time comes. And sometimes they have too much, so I mean they're wasting money. And sometimes they just don't know, which is also concerning. So this is a problem in public cloud, but it can also be a problem in SaaS. And keep in mind, we also have that shadow IT that we discussed earlier. Now, the other aspect of this I just want to highlight is this is not just a cost aspect, but a security issue as well. So let's think specifically in the SaaS use case. This was, again, from that same survey that we did, and the last chart there shows how many people said they are promptly offboarding former employees from SaaS solutions. And you can see it's only about a third. And even in companies that are offboarding, often that offboarding is happening maybe in those top 5 apps or top 10 apps that IT is closely monitoring and managing. But what about those other, that 888 that Symantec found that's in the shadows? And the challenge, of course, with that is, now you have ex-employees that have access to potentially sensitive data about not just your company, but also about potentially your customers. And so that's something that you want to close. So we need to start to manage this so we can make sure we're not only keeping costs under control, but we're also managing the risks associated with it. So the challenge, of course, is because we have that user-driven consumption and the use of cloud is continually changing, as we discussed earlier, this is not a once-and-done thing. So if I go out and I look at my cloud environment, whether SaaS, IaaS, PaaS, whatever, and I clean it up and I eliminate waste and I make sure we've got everything set up properly, 5 minutes later, it's not optimized anymore because new things have been provisioned, et cetera. And so I kind of line that to like the kids' playroom. You clean it up and 15 minutes later there's Legos all over the place. So what we need to move to is not kind of a intermittent cleaning, but really a continuous optimization. So here we have a picture of a Roomba, the automatic robot. So we need that for our cloud environments to be continually monitoring what's going on, looking at places where there's waste or security risk, alerting us about that, and potentially taking automated action, either just completely automatically hands-off mode or with human approval to say, hey, we see this looks out of whack. Should we go ahead and take this action to optimize it, whether from a spend or a risk perspective? Mr. User says, yes, please do that, and the system can do that automatically for you. So think about this as how are you going to have that continuous optimization across those SaaS, IaaS, and PaaS environments that you manage. All right, so I've set up some of the problems here and challenges. I want to turn it over to Joe Frieda, CFO from Flexera, and he's going to give us some advice on how to deal with those.
Thank you, Kim. Good afternoon, everyone. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about how the CFO, finance leader, and really the finance organization can partner with the CIO with regard to your cloud investment and cut across 4 different areas as it relates to that. First I want to talk about is in the area of procurement, and I've split this into 2 parts because they have different aspects as they relate to them. One is software as a service. This is a SaaS part of the cloud that Kim's touched on earlier. And just a general comment is there needs to be a solid alignment between the CIO and the CFO. The best optimized organizations as it relates to the IT organization are ones where the CIO and the CFO have great collaboration, great alignment, and great transparency into each other's businesses as it relates to that. So from the standpoint of SaaS applications and procuring those for your organization, this is a case where you're now dependent upon someone other than your IT organization to ensure that this application is available to your organization to run at any given time. Some of those might be back office type applications that aren't mission critical. Some of them are, though. In some cases, you're running critical parts of your business on an application that's SaaS. So from that standpoint, one of the key aspects of negotiating and procuring that application is to ensure that you have the requisite SLAs or service level agreements in place because downtime can obviously have a very detrimental, not only financial impact to your company, but also from a customer relationship standpoint. Optimizing your licenses you absolutely have to understand your true consumption needs relative to your ability to add licenses and capacity later in the contract term, or your ability to downsize that on future renewals. And that's especially critical if you're an organization that does a lot of M&A. Flexera, for instance, does a lot of M&A, and so we always make sure we negotiate in to any kind of SaaS arrangement our ability to dial up, usually dial up, not much dial down, but dial up our capacity over time. And that leads to the next point, which is knowing what that cost structure is, whether it's the cost related to increased capacity that you're adding over time, or what is the cost going to be upon the renewal of that license arrangement, that SaaS arrangement, at the point in time when you reach the end of the term. And then another part that is often overlooked, and I can't emphasize how critical this really is. Running a SaaS application means you're putting your data in someone else's hands. So from a CFO perspective in particular, but in coordination with your CIO and your CISO, you really need to understand how that data is going to be protected and how you can migrate that data to another provider if you decide to leave in the future. The SaaS application provider you might be using today obviously has an incentive to retain you as a customer, and obviously they're going to do all the things they can to keep you happy as a customer. But should you decide to leave, they have a disincentive to make it easy. So you want to make sure that you understand how your data can get moved so that you can move it to a future application provider. And obviously that's one of the big benefits of SaaS providers, is that you do have the ability and flexibility to move from one to the next.
One interesting note with that, that I noted with one, in my background with one SaaS provider, it's also how much time you have to move it, because sometimes they'll be like, hey, you have a 30-day window if you guys shut this down to move data out of the system. So that's an important aspect, is making sure whatever that time frame is enough for you to make that transition.
Yeah, great point, Kim. Yeah. And then the other side of this is procurement of the public cloud. So this is the IaaS and PaaS side of the cloud. Your ability to negotiate these contracts is fairly limited. As you saw from Kim's earlier slide, there's really a handful of major providers, really 1 to 2 very dominant ones. And this is where providers like a Gartner can give you advice on what you can and can't negotiate. And it's early days to some extent in this world, but growing. And at this point, a lot of the negotiating power is still in the hands of the cloud providers. Again, typically the procurement process is very focused around negotiating discounts. What's the best discount I can get on a particular acquisition or procurement? But really, negotiated discounts are really only a part of the savings. That continuous optimization process and the ability to do that, and then properly managing reserved instances can really save you a lot more money. And as Kim mentioned earlier, you certainly don't want to overcommit to reserved instances. This is a commitment, and so the CIO and the CFO have to really develop a clear strategy about how to manage that, really understanding the cost side of this equation, so that you make sure you've got the right level of approach, and keep in mind that the cloud scalability and flexibility is really one of the primary drivers of moving things to the cloud. So you still have that flexibility and ability to add more capacity over time. So you want to make sure you're not overcommitting on reserved instances and committing your organization to costs much earlier and to a greater extent than you need to. When we talk about migration, so the first thing you need to think about in terms of, you're contemplating migrating part of your IT organization and infrastructure over to the cloud is really by assessing your environment, making sure you understand what you have in place, and the CIO and CFO need to be really aligned on that. It's not unusual for the CIO organization and the finance organization to be misaligned on exactly what are all the IT assets in an organization. And obviously the larger more complex, more geographically dispersed an organization is, the harder it is to get that. But making sure that you understand all the assets that you have and everything about your environment is obviously the starting point for whatever you may be contemplating moving to a public cloud. And then it's really about understanding all of your usage today, both in terms of direct, network, storage costs, et cetera, but also the related cost structure that goes with that. As Kim mentioned earlier, around having, excess capacity, typically when you build out a data center, you build in extra capacity, you build in redundancy. You may have a backup data center, whether that's a one that you own or it's one through a co-location facility, but you've got more capacity than you really need. As you think about the cloud, that doesn't need to be replicated in the cloud. Again, scalability is really one of the key aspects of moving things to the cloud. So you really need to understand what's your utilization and capacity needs today, and make sure you right size accordingly. And the cost of the cloud at times to CFOs seems really expensive. We'll talk a little bit more later about operating expense versus capital expense. But the cloud can be, and many times is, much less expensive, but only if you're really optimizing. And the only way you can do that, again, is by really understanding everything that you have relative to your environment and all of your usage across that environment. From the standpoint of spend optimization, the third area I want to touch on, the CIO and the finance CFO is really starting. This is where you need to start focusing on the controls around the organization. We touched on already, Kim spent some time on shadow IT being as much as 40% of your IT spend across an organization. The CFO and the CIO need to have a strategy and a plan around how you can both be aware of what new cloud resources are getting used, and this includes things that people are putting on their corporate credit cards. We obviously use our own technology to do this as well, and my CIO and I are continually astounded, despite everything else, at the number of particularly SaaS apps and cloud instances that are spun up with somebody laying down a corporate credit card, and it adds up pretty rapidly at a few $100s here and a couple £1,000 there, and it ramps up pretty quickly. So there's tools that help do that and make sure that you're focused on that optimization, and it's really a continuous. You have to think about it as a continuous business process. It's not a one-time event. It's not a once a quarter that becomes part of a normal cyclical part of the business. It's really an ongoing continuous business process that you have to be put in place. Then you have to have visibility, again, into spend levels, and this is where having a regular cadence does pay off, because there needs to be some sort of cadence where the CIO and the CFO and their organizations are reviewing all that financial information on both spend and activity levels and making sure they're aligned, making sure they have transparency into that, making sure they're in agreement on what all that represents. And then the last part is really, as you're migrating and moving things to the cloud and moving both applications as well as infrastructure, make sure you're monitoring and reviewing your on-premise spend as well. So cloud is going to continue to ramp. It's not going anywhere. In fact, it's going to continue to grow, as Kim mentioned earlier. But you need to manage the on-premise applications and infrastructure, to eliminate and reduce that over time as the cloud continues to ramp. Sometimes that's a pure cost reduction. Other times it's a cost avoidance scenario where you can leverage one part of your infrastructure that's been moved to the cloud for another part of your on-premise infrastructure that, for one reason or another, is growing and not ready to be moved to the cloud at this point. And then my last area where CIO and CFO need to focus and really is a really critical one around governance and risk mitigation. There needs to be a really solid control structure that's in place to ensure that cloud purchases are getting vetted and approved. This is not a case where you're trying to prevent the business from running their business, and you're not preventing people from doing the things they need to drive the business forward. but it's really to ensure that what's being acquired meets some important criteria that in many cases get overlooked. Things that are important to both a CIO and a CFO around data security and data privacy, how things get integrated between systems, what types of data you might have that are being stored in a SaaS application, avoiding duplicative systems, and really not getting the benefit of economies of scale from a procurement standpoint because you've got too much shadow IT that isn't getting factored in from a procurement perspective with various vendors. And optimization solutions and having a continually optimization process going obviously greatly assists with that. In today's world, making sure you know where your data is being stored is really critical. That data residency is a growing issue and concern with the advent of GDPR, various privacy issues in countries, in some cases even states that have particular privacy issues that need to be monitored and managed accordingly. And so as you continue to do this, complexity becomes the enemy of good security is a comment my CIO mentions all the time. So make sure you understand and you have alignment between the CFO and the CIO around how those controls can meet your and most importantly your customer security requirements as it relates to the things that you're doing from that perspective. Data privacy is obviously a big issue. You continually hear of more and more cyber attacks, more and more issues and challenges from that perspective, and the CIO and CFO together can work well to mitigate those to the extent possible. What I'd like to do now is give those of you out there, CFOs and finance leaders, some direct actionable items that you can take away in terms of what you can do to help drive this and help support your CIO and your cloud strategy of your particular enterprise. First, it's really building cloud knowledge in your organization. This is more than just running Office 365 or SAP Concur for expenses. There's a lot of different types of cloud services, different types of cloud providers, and the implications of each of those have different sets of responsibilities and things that you need to focus on. And it's a great way for the CIO and their organization to get involved with the finance organization in terms of that education process. And then really looking at responsibilities between those two organizations as well. I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a regular cadence around analyzing and reporting on not only cloud spend, but really IT spend in general, but cloud in particular because it's complicated, it's difficult to manage, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger part of the pie as time goes on. Next, I think the CFO can play a really key role in helping to plan for change and managing that cloud spend. As I said earlier, the cloud's not going away, both from an application standpoint and from an infrastructure and platform standpoint. So I think this is where the CFO can help determine the applications and systems that can be moved to the cloud and helping from the standpoint of understanding the cost structure of what's involved, understanding what those assets are, where they're located, and a lot of times the finance organization is the keeper of a lot of those records. So it's a great opportunity to collaborate with the CIO as you're thinking about and they're thinking about their cloud strategy. And then the other part is, mentioned earlier, trying to forecast public cloud expense is really difficult. I can tell you from personal experience, as we continue to move more and more of our development work that's taking place, as well as we have more and more customers licensing them from us on a SaaS basis, we're consuming more and more public cloud all the time, and it's difficult for my finance organization and my IT organization to get on the same page as it relates to this. So it's a question I'm trying to answer very regularly, and we're getting better and better at it in terms of the level of detail and the transparency we have, and establishing that regular cadence to make sure we understand all of that cost structure. I touched on this earlier. The issue, especially if you're Some industries are very capital heavy, capital intensive, others are not. And it also depends sometimes if you're a publicly traded company, publicly listed, or privately held, where EBITDA tends to be a bigger focus and factor. The prevailing view tends to be sometimes that, gosh, the cloud is not a good option because it's a lot of operating expense. True, but however, there's a lot of operating expenses related to on-premise costs as well, not only for applications but also your infrastructure that go away at the point in time when you migrate things to the cloud. I'm not about to give accounting advice, but there are limited cases and ways in which companies have been able to figure out how to capitalize reserved instances as well. So there is some ability to capitalize some of this cost on and again, I'm not providing accounting advice, but I think that the analysis around OpEx and CapEx is one that really requires a great deal of attention and focus. And then from the standpoint of reporting, again, I think the ability of either showback or in some cases chargeback. Showback is a great way to start because the broader organization now can see what they're spending as it relates to the cloud, and then they can better assess, the why and the how as it relates to that cloud spend. And at some point, from a maturity standpoint, you can then decide if you want to go to a chargeback model, where you're actually charging those cloud costs back to various parts of the organization by business unit or whatever the case may be. And then the fourth area is just ongoing management. Setting up, first of all, some guardrails, some guidelines that relate to the budgets. Being a CFO, a key aspect of being a CFO is stewardship of the assets of the business. And so from this standpoint, you got to think about cloud costs and everything that relates to that as being making sure you're spending those assets wisely. And so cloud costs can get out of control. And again, they're hard to manage and hard to forecast. So making sure you've got the proper guardrails and process in place around how you identify and analyze and report on those becomes really critical. The CFO also needs to get involved in the optimization process. Don't be intimidated thinking, well, it's a cloud issue. It's really an IT issue. My CIO will take care of that. She or he is going to be looking for the CFO and the finance organization to really develop that ongoing optimization process, because a big chunk of that relates to the cost structure in addition to other operational sort of data that the CIO organization will have. And so I think this is a great place, again, for collaboration. It's an opportunity to really bring those two organizations closer together and try and manage this important cost structure. And then the last part, from an ongoing management is really having that reserved instance strategy, how you plan for and think about procurement for cloud costs, and really having, this requires a little bit of a change in terms of how you think about procurement, both from a timing standpoint and negotiation standpoint, and the key things that you focus on to get the best bang for your buck, as the saying goes, as it relates to the cloud. So with that, I will turn things back over to Joe Fleischer for another polling question.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. And it's really great to hear your perspective following up on Kim's. And indeed, as Joe mentioned, we're going to pose the third of our three polling questions. Then I think we have time for maybe a few quick questions from attendees. Our third polling question asks attendees to indicate within what time frame, if any, your company intends to identify opportunities to optimize its investments in cloud technology. What attendees are welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then click on the submit button so that we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are: my company is already doing so this year, next year, my company does not intend to do so, or I don't know. And after you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, we do ask that you click on the submit button so that we can record the time frame, if any, in which your company does indeed intend to identify opportunities to optimize its investments in cloud technology. And what we can see just briefly is that A plurality have indicated that you're already doing so, so kudos to those who are. I would acknowledge the next most prevalent response is I don't know, about a quarter of respondents. That's fine. That's why you're here. I would also acknowledge that close to a quarter have indicated you're planning to do so if you're not already doing so already later this year or perhaps next year. So that's very encouraging, and we do have time, as I mentioned, to address at least one question from an attendee. And Joe, this is a question for you. An attendee asks, what areas of application adoption are being led by finance teams and or CFOs?
Thank you, Joe. Great question. And from the question specifically focusing on application adoption, I'll kind of break that into a couple of parts. Certainly, CFO and the CFO organization is leading the effort of adoption of financial systems. For instance, here at Flexera, we have moved to all SaaS applications for everything we do, from financial reporting, planning, budgeting, general ledger, all that sort of thing. So I think the CFO is probably driving the adoption of those. But I think also CFOs are increasingly involved in really the adoption of all applications moving to the cloud as IT costs continue to increase. Kim mentioned earlier how SaaS and cloud spend is continuing to grow at a much higher pace than the overall cost of IT. So I think my view is every company at this point is somehow a technology company. So as a CFO, you want to be involved in that adoption for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is you want to make sure that you understand the process, you want to make sure you understand the costs, make sure that you're getting good procurement process around that. You're trying to address, from a control standpoint, the issues of shadow IT, which can be a pretty significant portion of spend. And then also it's a risk management, risk mitigation issue, which is a big focus of CFOs. Again, because of where the data may be going or how it's getting used, privacy concerns, all sorts of things. From a CFO's perspective, you want to be at the forefront of this and make sure you're managing everything accordingly.
Thank you very much, Joe and Kim. And indeed, we've received great questions from attendees. We may not have had the opportunity to address all. We will plan to follow up on any remaining questions after our webcast. I would note this webcast will be available on demand later this week within the webcast section or past webinar section of CFO.com. At that point, you'll be able to view and listen to a streaming archive of our webcast, download a PDF document comprising slides, and click on links to view information about upcoming events that offer the opportunity to hear from and meet finance leaders in person. Also, if you've answered all 3 polling questions, you'll be able to retrieve your CPE certificate. Before our webcast concludes, we will invite you to complete an online feedback survey. That feedback survey will appear in a separate browser window that you will be able to view if you've turned off your pop-up blocker within your web browser. As always, we appreciate your feedback. Now, I made reference to upcoming events. I would like to tell you and extend an invitation to join CFO Live in New York City. That'll be on November 13th and November 14th. CFO Live is a conference that will bring together several hundred finance leaders and other senior executives who share the aim of redefining the future of finance. More information is available at live.cfo.com. Also, if you do plan to join us, when you sign up, we ask that you enter the code WebinarVIP for $200 off your conference pass. Again, more information about CFO Live is available at live.cfo.com. Once again, want to thank Kim and Joe for such an engaging discussion and informative discussion. And we want to thank attendees for joining us for our webcast, How Finance Leaders Partner with CFOs and Partner with CIOs to Drive Maximum Business Value from the Cloud. Brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and sponsored by Flexera. We thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.